The telegram arrived at 10 minutes past 9 on the morning of March 14, 1902, and sat on the desk of the Great Northern Railway Station in Shelby, Montana, for nearly 40 minutes before anyone thought to act on it. The message itself was brief, almost apologetic in tone. Weather conditions deteriorating west of Marias Pass. Advise delayed departure for eastbound passenger service. The station master, a methodical man named Howard Gaines, read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it beneath the blotter on his desk. Outside, the sky was overcast but stable. The wind had not yet picked up. There seemed to be plenty of time to consider the matter. Train number 47, the Empire Builder's local cousin, sat on the platform with its boiler warm and its passenger manifest complete. 23 souls were aboard that morning. 16 passengers, 6 crew members, and 1 railway postal clerk. Most had been waiting since dawn. The train was already 90 minutes behind schedule due to a coupling delay in Havre, and the mood among the travelers was one of mild irritation rather than concern. They had paid for passage. They expected to move. The conductor, William Reardon, was a veteran of 18 years on the northern routes. He had seen spring weather turn before, everyone had. But March was not February, and Shelby was not the mountains. He stood on the platform smoking a cigarette and consulting his pocket watch. The delay, he calculated, would add another hour to their arrival in Cutbank. Inconvenient, certainly, but hardly catastrophic. Inside the single-passenger car, a schoolteacher from Minneapolis named Clara Whitmore had spread her teaching materials across an empty seat and was making notes in the margins of a grammar textbook. Across the aisle, 2 ranch hands played cards with a worn deck, their conversation low and sporadic. Near the rear of the car, a young mother nursed her infant beneath a shawl while her older child, a boy of perhaps 4, pressed his face against the cold glass and traced patterns in the condensation. No one appeared troubled. The car smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, and the faint sweetness of someone's packed lunch. It was the smell of 100 other journeys, routine and forgettable. At 9:52 a.m., Gaines finally walked to the platform and handed the telegram to Reardon. The conductor read it, nodded, and folded it into his coat pocket. "How bad?" he asked. "Hard to say," Gaines replied. "Might be nothing. Might be advisable to wait." Reardon looked westward, where the track disappeared into a landscape of low hills and scattered pine. The air was still. He could see no storm. "We're already late," he said. "I know it. Passengers are restless. I know that too." They stood in silence for a moment, 2 men performing a calculus that felt familiar and safe. The telegram had said advise, not prohibit. It had not used the word danger, and there was a schedule to keep, a timetable printed and distributed, a promise made to people who had arranged their lives around it. "If we leave now," Reardon said, "we'll be through the pass by early afternoon. Weather won't catch us." Gaines said nothing. He had no authority to stop the train, only to relay information. The decision, as always, belonged to the crew. At 10:04 a.m., Reardon gave the signal. The engine released a short blast of steam, and the train began to move. It pulled away from the platform at a cautious speed, the wheels catching their rhythm on the frozen rails. Inside the car, passengers adjusted their positions and settled back into their private thoughts. The boy at the window waved at nothing in particular as the station receded behind them. In the railway office, Gaines returned to his desk and made a notation in the logbook. Train 47 departed Shelby, 10:04 a.m. Telegram forwarded to conductor. Weather advisory acknowledged. Later, when investigators reviewed the records, they would note that at this precise moment, 10:04 on the morning of March 14, 1902, the train could have been recalled with a single flag signal. The engine had not yet cleared the switching yard. The station remained in sight. Reardon could have stopped, backed up, waited. No one raised the flag. The first hour of the journey passed without incident. Train 47 moved through open country at a steady pace, following the path of the Marias River as it curved northwest toward the mountains. The landscape was familiar to anyone who had traveled this route before. Grassland broken by coulees, patches of snow lingering in the shadows, the occasional stand of cottonwood marking a creek bed. It was not beautiful country exactly, but it was comprehensible. A person could see for miles in any direction. There were no surprises here. Inside the passenger car, routines asserted themselves. The schoolteacher, Clara Whitmore, had finished her notes and now sat reading a novel she had brought from Minneapolis. She had made this trip twice before, once in summer and once in autumn, and found the scenery monotonous but soothing. The rocking of the car helped her think. She planned to arrive in Cutbank by mid-afternoon, stay overnight at a boarding house she had been recommended, and then continue west the following morning to a small teaching post in Columbia Falls. She had written to the school board to confirm her arrival. Everything was arranged. The two ranch hands had grown bored with cards and now sat in silence, one dozing with his hat pulled low, the other staring out the window with the blank expression of a man accustomed to long stretches of inactivity. They were returning from a cattle sale in Havre and carried their wages in money belts beneath their shirts. Neither spoke of weather. Weather was a constant, not a crisis. The young mother had managed to coax her infant to sleep and now held the child against her shoulder, swaying gently with the motion of the train. Her older son had abandoned the window and was now sitting on the floor between the seats, building a small tower from wooden blocks his mother had packed. She watched him with a tired, patient expression. Her name was Anne Duval, and she was traveling to meet her husband, who worked as a freight manager in Kalispell. The journey was supposed to take 2 days. She had provisions for 3, just to be safe. Near the front of the car sat a traveling salesman named Morton Blake, a man in his mid-50s who dealt in agricultural equipment and spent most of his life on trains. He had a sample case at his feet and a folded newspaper on his lap, though he wasn't reading it. Instead, he was calculating profit margins in a small leather notebook, his pencil moving in quick, precise strokes. He had been making this circuit for 11 years and prided himself on his punctuality. Delays annoyed him, but he had learned to accept them. Complaining changed nothing. The postal clerk, a quiet man named Everett Stone, worked in the small baggage section at the front of the car, sorting letters into canvas sacks. He wore a green eyeshade and worked by the light of a single lamp. The mail had to be processed regardless of delays, and he took a certain satisfaction in the mechanical nature of the task. Every letter had a destination. Every destination had a route. It was a system that made sense. At 11:20 a.m., the train slowed as it approached the water stop at Blackfoot. This was a routine pause, scheduled into every run. The crew needed to refill the engine's tanks, and passengers were permitted to step onto the platform and stretch their legs if they wished. Most did not. It was cold outside, and the stop would last only 15 minutes. Conductor Reardon stepped down from the train and walked the length of the platform, checking couplings and running his eye over the wheels. Everything appeared sound. The engineer, a taciturn man named Frank Collier, leaned from the cab and called down, "Any word on the weather?" "Nothing new," Reardon replied. "Looks fine to me. Looks fine to everyone." This was true. The sky remained overcast, but there was no precipitation, no visible wind. The temperature hovered just below freezing, uncomfortable perhaps, but not alarming. A few passengers had disembarked and now stood near the station house, smoking or simply standing in the cold air. One of the ranch hands bought a cup of coffee from a vendor and drank it quickly, grimacing at the heat. At 11:37 a.m., the train resumed its journey. The landscape began to shift as they moved closer to the mountains. The flatness gave way to gentle rises, and the vegetation grew thicker. They were entering the transitional zone where the plains met the Rockies, a region of unpredictable microclimates and sudden shifts in terrain. But the track here was well maintained, and the train moved smoothly. Inside the car, conversations had dwindled. The salesman had put away his notebook and now dozed with his arms crossed. The schoolteacher had set down her novel and was gazing out the window, her expression distant. The ranch hands remained silent. Even the child on the floor had grown quiet, stacking and restacking his blocks without commentary. At noon, Reardon passed through the car to check on the passengers. It was a formality, a gesture of reassurance. He paused briefly beside Anne Duval and smiled at the sleeping infant. "Doing all right, Mom?" he asked. "Just fine," she said. "We'll have you in Cutbank in a few hours." "That's good to know." He moved on, his boots clicking softly on the wooden floor. Everything was in order. The passengers were calm. The crew was competent. The train was making progress. No one had mentioned the telegram since leaving Shelby. Later, when questioned, Reardon would explain that he had assessed the situation continuously throughout the journey. He had watched the sky. He had consulted with Collier. He had considered turning back at Blackfoot. But there had been no evidence of danger. Nothing tangible. Nothing immediate. The advisory had been vague, and the schedule, once disrupted, was difficult to restore. He had made what seemed like a reasonable decision based on the information available to him. The investigators would not dispute this. They would note, however, that weather advisories in that region were rarely issued without cause, and that the phrase deteriorating conditions had a specific meaning among those who worked the mountain routes. But meaning, of course, requires interpretation, and interpretation requires time. The wind arrived at 12:43 p.m., approximately 20 miles east of the summit of Marias Pass. It did not announce itself dramatically. There was no sudden gust, no violent shift in pressure. Instead, it came as a gradual increase in resistance, a thickening of the air that the engineer Frank Collier noticed first as a subtle change in the engine's performance. The train, which had been maintaining a steady climb, began to labor slightly. Collier adjusted the throttle and leaned out to check the track ahead. The sky had darkened, not all at once, but incrementally, as though someone were slowly drawing a curtain across the sun. The overcast that had seemed benign an hour earlier now pressed lower, the clouds moving with a strange uniformity from west to east. Collier had seen this before. He pulled back into the cab and wiped his face with a rag. "Getting colder," he said to the fireman, a young man named Sam Petrie. Petrie nodded. He was feeding coal into the firebox, his movements automatic. "You want to slow down?" Not yet. They were committed now to the climb. The pass lay ahead, roughly 8 miles distant. Once they crested the summit and began the descent toward the western slope, they would be sheltered by the mountains themselves. The danger, if there was danger, existed only in this transitional zone, the open stretch where wind could gather speed and snow could accumulate without obstruction. Collier checked his watch. If they maintained their current pace, they would reach the summit by 1:30 p.m. That seemed achievable. He had no reason to believe otherwise. In the passenger car, the change in atmosphere was less obvious but still perceptible. The rocking of the train had become slightly irregular, and the light from the windows had dimmed to a flat, grey sameness. Clara Whitmore looked up from her book and realized she had been reading the same paragraph 3 times without comprehension. She glanced around the car. The other passengers appeared unchanged, but there was a quality to the silence now that felt less restful than it had earlier. Anne Duval shifted the infant to her other shoulder and looked down at her son, who had fallen asleep on the floor beside his blocks. She considered waking him and moving him to the seat, but he seemed comfortable where he was. Outside, the trees were beginning to sway. At 1:08 p.m., the first snow began to fall. It was light at first, small, dry flakes that drifted past the windows without accumulating. Morton Blake, the salesman, watched them with mild interest. He had traveled through worse. Everyone had. Snow in March was hardly unusual. He returned his attention to his newspaper. Conductor Reardon was standing near the rear of the car when he noticed the temperature drop. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the kind of cold that seeps through clothing and settles in the bones. He walked to the front of the car and looked out through the small window in the door. The track ahead was still visible, but the landscape beyond had become indistinct, softened by the falling snow. He stepped into the baggage section where Everett Stone was still sorting mail. "Storm's starting," Reardon said. Stone looked up. "Bad?" "Don't know yet." "Should we stop?" Reardon considered this. Stopping meant reversing, and reversing on a grade was dangerous. The nearest siding was back at Blackfoot, more than 15 miles behind them. To retreat now would require careful coordination and significant time, and they were already closer to the summit than to their last stop. Forward still seemed safer than backward. "We keep going," Reardon said. Stone nodded and returned to his work. At 1:22 p.m., the wind intensified. It came now in waves, buffeting the side of the train and creating a low, whistling sound that penetrated the walls of the passenger car. The snow thickened, no longer drifting but driving horizontally, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. Collier reduced speed. The train was moving at perhaps 15 miles per hour now, crawling up the grade as the wind fought against it. Petrie shoveled coal faster, trying to maintain pressure, but the cold was sapping the engine's efficiency. Steam condensed in the cylinders. Ice began to form on the exterior fittings. In the passenger car, the mood had shifted. The ranch hands were awake now, sitting upright and watching the windows. The schoolteacher had closed her book and was gripping the edge of her seat. Anne Duval had pulled her son onto her lap and was holding both children close, her face pale but composed. No one spoke. At 1:35 p.m., the train crested the summit of Marias Pass and began the descent. For a brief moment it seemed as though the worst was over. The wind, which had been roaring against the front of the engine, now shifted direction and became a force at their backs. The snow, though still heavy, no longer seemed to impede their progress. Collier allowed himself a small breath of relief. But the descent presented its own dangers. The track on the western slope was steeper and more exposed, carved into the side of the mountain with long stretches of open air to the south. Snow was accumulating rapidly here, covering the rails and making it difficult to judge the condition of the roadbed beneath. At 1:47 p.m., Collier felt the wheels slip. It was a brief sensation, almost imperceptible, a momentary loss of traction as the drive wheels encountered a patch of ice beneath the snow. He applied the brakes gently, trying to slow without locking the wheels. The train shuddered and then caught again, continuing its descent. But now he was frightened. He leaned out of the cab and looked back along the length of the train. The passenger car was barely visible through the snow. He could not see the track behind them. He could not see anything except white. This was the moment. Later, investigators would identify 1:47 p.m. on March 14, 1902, as the point of decision. The last opportunity to stop the train safely and wait for the storm to pass. There was a maintenance shed roughly half a mile ahead, a small wooden structure used by track crews in the summer. It offered no real shelter, but it marked a widening in the roadbed where the train could have halted without risk of sliding backward. The crew could have secured the brakes, banked the fire, and settled in to wait. Collier knew the shed was there. He had passed it dozens of times. But stopping required certainty, and certainty required information he did not have. How long would the storm last? Hours? Days? Was the shed even accessible in these conditions, and if they stopped, would they be able to start again? Or would the snow bury them in place? He made a calculation. They were less than 10 miles from the town of Essex, where there was a proper station, a telegraph office, and shelter. If they could maintain their current speed, they could reach it in under an hour. That seemed preferable to stopping in the middle of nowhere, with no resources and no communication. It was a reasonable calculation. At 1:49 p.m., the train passed the maintenance shed and continued its descent. The opportunity was gone. The train did not reach Essex. At approximately 2:20 p.m., on a curve 2 miles west of the summit, the locomotive's wheels lost traction on a section of track buried under 8 inches of wind-compacted snow and ice. The engine slowed, shuddered, and then stopped altogether, its drive wheels spinning uselessly. Frank Collier threw the throttle into reverse, attempting to back down and gain momentum for another attempt, but the wheels refused to grip. The train sat motionless on the slope, held in place only by the brakes and the friction of metal against ice. Within 20 minutes, the storm had fully engulfed them. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The wind, funneled through the mountain pass, reached speeds estimated later at 60 miles per hour. Snow accumulated at a rate of nearly 2 inches per hour. The temperature fell to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The passenger car, heated only by a single coal stove at one end, grew steadily colder. Conductor Reardon made his way forward to the engine to confer with Collier. The two men shouted to each other over the roar of the wind, their breath visible in the freezing air. "Can we move?" Reardon yelled. "No traction," Collier shouted back. "Rails are iced over. Can you back us down?" "Same problem, we're stuck." They stood in silence for a moment, both men understanding the implications. The train could not move forward. It could not move backward, and the storm showed no sign of abating. "How long can we keep the engine running?" Reardon asked. "Coal will last through the night," Collier said. "Maybe into tomorrow if we're careful." "And then?" Collier did not answer. Reardon returned to the passenger car and assembled the passengers in the center aisle. His voice was calm, almost apologetic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we've encountered difficult track conditions and will need to remain here until the storm passes. We have adequate fuel to keep the car heated, and we are in no immediate danger. I ask that you remain calm and stay inside the car. Do not attempt to leave the train for any reason." The passengers received this information in silence. There were no hysterics, no outbursts. Clara Whitmore asked how long the delay might last. Reardon said he could not say for certain, but he expected the weather to improve by morning. Anne Duval asked if there was water available. The fireman, Sam Petrie, brought a bucket of melted snow from the engine. It tasted of coal and metal, but it was drinkable. The hours that followed were characterized by a strange, enforced patience. The passengers rationed what food they had brought. The ranch hands shared tobacco. The salesman, Morton Blake, distributed hard candies from his sample case. The schoolteacher read aloud from her novel to the young boy, Anne Duval's son, who listened with solemn attention. Outside, the storm continued. By nightfall, the snow had buried the lower half of the passenger car's windows. The wind rattled the walls and found every gap in the construction. Frost formed on the interior surfaces. The coal stove, fed carefully by Everett Stone, provided a small sphere of warmth, but the far ends of the car grew bitterly cold. At 8:30 p.m., the infant began to cry, a thin, persistent sound that Anne Duval could not soothe. The child was cold and hungry, and her milk had begun to fail under the stress of the situation. She wrapped the baby in every piece of clothing she could spare and held it close, rocking and murmuring. The other passengers pretended not to hear. At 11:00 p.m., and the coal stove began to falter. Stone had been stretching the fuel as far as possible, but the supply was nearly exhausted. He conferred quietly with Reardon. "We'll need to burn something else," Stone said. "What do we have?" "The mail sacks. Some of the wooden crates in the baggage section." Reardon hesitated. Burning U.S. mail was a federal offense, but the alternative was freezing. "Do it," he said. The canvas sacks burned quickly, producing a brief, acrid heat. The wooden crates lasted longer but filled the car with smoke. Passengers covered their faces with scarves and handkerchiefs. The air became difficult to breathe. At 2 a.m., the storm finally began to weaken. The wind dropped. The snow thinned. By dawn, the sky had cleared to a pale, brittle blue. Collier and Petrie attempted to restart the engine, but the cold had frozen the water in the boiler's auxiliary lines. They worked for 3 hours, using fire and tools, before achieving enough steam pressure to move the train. At 9:30 a.m. on March 15th, nearly 20 hours after becoming stranded, Train 47 limped into the station at Essex, moving at less than 5 miles per hour. All 23 people aboard survived. 3 required medical treatment for frostbite. Anne Duval's infant developed pneumonia and spent 2 weeks in a hospital in Kalispell before recovering. Clara Whitmore arrived at her teaching post a week late and was reprimanded by the school board. The ranch hands lost 2 days of work. Morton Blake missed his appointments in Spokane. The Great Northern Railway issued a formal apology and refunded the passengers' fares. An internal investigation was conducted. The findings were published in a brief report dated April 2, 1902. The report noted that conductor Reardon and engineer Collier had acted within the bounds of their training and experience. The decision to proceed despite the weather advisory was characterized as an error in judgment, but not a dereliction of duty. The report recommended improved communication protocols between stations and clearer guidelines for interpreting weather warnings. No one was formally disciplined. When interviewed, the survivors expressed a variety of opinions. Some blamed the railway for inadequate precautions. Others blamed the weather. A few blamed no one at all, accepting the experience as simply one of those things that happen. Clara Whitmore, in a letter written to her sister 3 weeks after the incident, made an observation that would later be quoted in historical analyses of the event. The strangest part was how ordinary it all felt, even as it was happening. We were uncomfortable, certainly, and frightened toward the end. But there was no moment of revelation, no instant when we understood we were in danger. It crept up on us so gradually that by the time we recognized it, there was nothing to be done but wait. Frank Collier, the engineer, gave testimony that was more technical. He described the conditions of the track, the behavior of the engine, the calculations he had made. When asked if he would have done anything differently, he paused for a long time before answering. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe, probably, but I can't say what exactly." Everything seemed manageable until it wasn't. The maintenance shed, the place where the train could have stopped at 1:47 p.m., was examined by investigators. It was found to be structurally sound and accessible. Snow had accumulated around it, but not enough to prevent a train from halting nearby. The siding was clear. If they had stopped, they would have been uncomfortable. They might have spent a cold night, but they would have been safe, and the train would have been able to resume its journey the following morning once the storm had passed. The distance between that decision point and the place where the train ultimately became stranded was less than 2 miles. In his official statement, Conductor Reardon addressed this directly. "I believed we had more time. I believed the conditions would improve, or at least not worsen significantly. I believed that pressing forward was the safer choice. I was wrong on all counts, but I did not know I was wrong until it was too late to correct the error." The railway's legal department reviewed the case and determined that no negligence had occurred. The incident was classified as an unavoidable accident resulting from unforeseen weather conditions. The passengers disagreed with this characterization, but they had no legal recourse. The tickets they had purchased contained a clause absolving the railway of responsibility for delays or dangers caused by acts of nature. Anne Duval, when asked years later about the experience, would say only, "We thought there was time. Everyone thought there was time. That was the problem." The case of Train 47 occupies a minor place in the historical record of American railway disasters. No one died. No property of significant value was destroyed. The incident merited a few paragraphs in regional newspapers and a brief mention in the Great Northern Railway's annual report. Within a year, it had been largely forgotten, and yet it endures in the archives, not as a catastrophe but as an example of something more subtle and more common, the failure that results not from dramatic error but from incremental misjudgment compounded by the assumption of safety. The telegram that arrived in Shelby at 9:10 a.m. on March 14, 1902, was not ignored. It was read, considered, and acted upon. The conductor was informed. The decision to proceed was made consciously, not carelessly. At every stage, the crew and the passengers believed they were behaving reasonably. This is the central fact of the case. Reason itself can be misleading. When investigators later mapped the sequence of events, they identified at least 4 distinct moments when the outcome could have been changed. The train could have been delayed in Shelby, it could have turned back at Blackfoot, it could have halted at the maintenance shed. Even after becoming stranded, different decisions regarding fuel conservation might have improved conditions inside the passenger car. But each of these alternatives required acting on incomplete information and accepting certain costs. Delay, inconvenience, professional embarrassment, in exchange for uncertain benefits. And human beings, even experienced and competent ones, are poor at making such calculations when the danger feels abstract and the schedule feels concrete. The weather advisory had used the word deteriorating, but weather is always deteriorating or improving. It is never static. The word conveyed information but not urgency. It suggested caution but did not mandate action. And so, the train departed. What makes this case instructive is not the severity of the outcome, but the ordinariness of the process. There was no villainy, no incompetence, no recklessness. There was only the accumulation of small decisions, each of which seemed justified in the moment, each of which narrowed the range of options available later. By the time conductor Reardon realized the full extent of the danger, standing in a passenger car that smelled of smoke and fear, watching frost creep across the windows while an infant cried and the stove guttered on its last fuel, there was nothing left to do but endure. The moment for action had passed hours earlier, slipping away so quietly that no one had noticed. This is the pattern that repeats throughout history in contexts far removed from Montana snowstorms. The failure to evacuate before the flood, the delay in treating the infection, the missed opportunity to turn back from the summit, the assumption that there will be time to correct course later. Sometimes there is time, often there is not. The passengers of Train 47 were fortunate. They suffered, but they survived. The infant recovered from pneumonia. The school teacher eventually reached her post. The ranch hands returned home. Life continued. But in the margins of their statements, in the pauses during testimony, in the careful phrasing of their letters, one can detect a shared realization that they had come closer to disaster than they understood at the time, that the gap between inconvenience and catastrophe had been narrower than it appeared, that the safety they felt, the certainty that everything would work out because it always had before, was an illusion maintained only by luck. Years later, when the Great Northern Railway updated its protocols for weather advisories, the new guidelines included a provision that seemed almost redundant. When in doubt, delay departure. It was a rule born from the recognition that the cost of unnecessary caution is almost always less than the cost of misplaced confidence. The rule did not reference Train 47 specifically. It did not need to. The lesson was not unique to that particular train or that particular storm. It was the lesson of every incident where people believed they had time and were wrong. In the station master's logbook from Shelby, Montana, the entry for March 14, 1902 remains legible even now, more than a century later. The handwriting is neat and unhurried. The notation is brief. Train 47 departed Shelby 10:04 a.m. Telegram forwarded to conductor. Weather advisory acknowledged. There is no indication in the text that Howard Gaines, the man who wrote those words, felt any particular concern. There is no marginal note, no underlining, no mark of emphasis. It is simply a record of a routine departure on an unremarkable morning. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of the entire case. That even in retrospect, even knowing what happened next, the decision to let the train leave does not seem obviously wrong. It seems instead like exactly the kind of choice people make every day, weighing imperfect information, balancing competing priorities, assuming that problems can be managed as they arise. Most of the time, that assumption is correct, but not always. And the difference between the two, between the times when there is time and the times when there is not, is often impossible to perceive until it is too late. The train left the station. The storm arrived. 23 people spent a night trapped on a frozen mountain, burning mail to stay warm. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the problem.